Hello everyone, welcome to today's episode of Ray Hall Tech. Today's episode, I'm going to take a look at this Nintendo that is running behind me. I bought this at an auction, and it's going to involve some soldering for me to fix it. I'm not great at soldering, I'm still learning how to do a lot of it, so if you see something wrong with my technique or whatever, you can mention it to me in the comments, post a video tutorial. I definitely want to learn more about how to do it and get better at it. And the video is kind of dark. I could not actually get both of my studio lights working. I got new bulbs in this morning, so I'm actually lighting both sides of my face. But during this video recording session, I can only record with light on one side, so if it's a little dark, I do apologize for that. But without further ado, let's get into getting this Nintendo fixed and up and running. In order to get started, I want to show you a few things that this Nintendo is doing. One of the common problems a Nintendo will have, when you turn it on, it will power on. You can see the power light is solid, it's recognizing that there's a cartridge, but it just goes to a gray screen. If I shut off the Nintendo, if I adjust the cartridge just enough, and I turn it on, I got a gray screen again. There for a second you saw the Nintendo flash, and I have a display now, so it's reading it a little bit better, but it's still having some issues. So we're making progress. So as you can see, after playing with it for a while, I can't get Mario to work. If I shut it off and take the cartridge out, let's try Tetris. Tetris does the same thing, so it's not a cartridge issue. I've actually played both of these games on this Nintendo without any issues, but it takes forever to get them to work in the cartridge slot. I'm going to play with it, get the game up and running, and just show you what it's doing next. It could take me a few minutes to do this, so I'm going to cut the video and I'll just come back when the game is working. So I've taken the camera out of its mount, and I hope you can see this, but there's a lot of artifacts in the screen. It's not actually a clear background, and if I move up to the text, you know, where it says Mario, it's having a problem focusing. Maybe if I come back a little bit more. There you can really see the artifacts, and the Mario, even the edge of the O and stuff, isn't very clear. It's kind of jagged. And even if I'm playing the game, that's what it looks like. So as you saw with this Nintendo, my two big problems were that I can't put in cartridges and have them read reliably, and that there's a lot of distortion on the screen. Here in my hand, I have the original Nintendo AC adapter. This actually inputs 120 volt AC, and it'll put out AC 9 volt. This Nintendo power adapter can actually take in AC or DC, but the capacitors have to work harder when you're using AC. And so I'm going to replace the capacitors. They're 30 years old. I think the Nintendo came to the US somewhere around 85, 86. I think I got my first Nintendo in 1989. These capacitors will help with that distorted screen, make sure that they're filtering out the noise from the power adapter. And then I have a new connector. These connectors break all the time, so we'll get this put in, and we should be able to get this Nintendo back up and running. But if you look at the Nintendo, you can see it's really bright here and kind of yellowed here. I don't have retro bright equipment, so I'm not going to do that right now. But let's resolder all the capacitors, get the connector changed, and get this Nintendo working again. Tearing down the Nintendo is actually really straightforward. All of the screws in the Nintendo are identical except for two silver screws. I think the silver screws are longer, but they actually hold in the back of the tray for the cartridge. You know, when you slide in your Nintendo game, you actually push it down. There's 6 screws holding in that assembly, and 2 of them are silver. So as long as you don't mess up the placement of those screws, you can't really do much. You do definitely want to be careful pulling apart a Nintendo. Plastic gets brittle over time, and you just don't want to be too forceful and break anything as you put it together or tear it apart. But inside the Nintendo, there's I guess a silver RF shield is what I'll call it, that covers everything. You take that shield off, then you can loosen the motherboard and the bottom RF shields. Once everything is loose, you can unplug all the connectors for like the power, the reset, the controllers, and then if you lift up the board a little bit, you can slide out the cartridge tray and take the entire thing out of the unit. It's actually pretty straightforward. You can't put it in wrong. The only thing you want to be careful of is when you do put it back together, not to smash the wires for the controllers or for the power buttons. But I guess when I said all of the screws are the same, there's a couple screws that hold the power button and reset button assembly together. Those screws are unique, and when you have the entire system out, there's a couple of screws in the power socket that are extremely small. So I guess there are a few different types of screws, but in general, you don't have to touch any of the screws. You shouldn't have to take any of those apart unless you're washing the entire case. Just because they do get disgusting. And in this montage, I did take it all the way down so that there's nothing left in the case. So I did take out all of the power cables and everything, so I could definitely give it a bath because it was pretty gross. With the Nintendo disassembled, the first thing that I want to repair is the power supply capacitors. The capacitors filter incoming voltage, and the RF modulator and the AV outputs are also in the power supply unit, so when those capacitors aren't working correctly, they can give you dirty image. One of the unique things about the Nintendo is that while it came with a 9-volt AC adapter, you could use it with a DC adapter. And in some cases, people would switch to the DC adapter, which would fix some of the screen distortion because the capacitors didn't have to work as hard at filtering out noise. But in this case, I'm just going to go ahead and replace them to make sure everything is good to go. It took me a few minutes to figure out how to fully disassemble the power supply. There was a couple of metal sheets clipped onto the top and the bottom, but once you had those removed, there were several solder points that held the circuit board to the power supply frame, so you had to desolder each of those ground points, and once those were unsoldered, you had to remove the grounding pin for the AV jacks and the RF output, because all of those things, the way they're soldered in, had to be removed. And then once that was done, I struggled for a little bit, and then I realized that I also had to desolder the power jack because I couldn't get the assembly out with the switch for channel 3 or channel 4 and the power supply still connected. But after a little bit of fiddling and desoldering, I got the assembly pulled apart. With the power supply PCB fully exposed, I was able to start changing capacitors. I started with the power supply itself, and I only changed one capacitor at a time. That was to ensure I didn't mix up any voltages or capacitor ratings. And on the silk screen for the power supply, each capacitor was marked with a circle. Half of the circle was filled in with white. That indicated the negative side. On the Nintendo's mainboard side, the capacitors were marked, but they only had a plus symbol. I'm assuming that's because there was a lot more silk screening on the motherboard, so they used different nomenclature, or it was a different factory, whatever. But it was pretty obvious which way the capacitors went in, so you shouldn't mix that up even if you weren't paying attention when you took them out. But with all of the capacitors changed, I could start reassembling the Nintendo, get the power supply reattached since it's soldered in, and we're ready to move on to the 72-pin connector. Now that I'm ready to put on the 72-pin connector, I wanted to clean the connector just to make sure it was good to go, that it wouldn't have any problems. And I know there's some folks out there that don't like the Chinese connectors. They say that they're too tight on the cartridge or they don't work all the time. And you can refurbish your own and it's better. I was having problems refurbishing my own, so I went ahead and bought the connector. And I'm going to use it to get started. and hopefully everything works out, but just know that sometimes those connectors don't work very well. Just make sure you put it on correctly. The screw holes will line up, and the part for the cartridge actually goes up away from the components. You actually want the expansion connector for the Nintendo to be down. I made a mistake when I was reassembling the Nintendo. I forgot to put the RF shield on the bottom before I put in the motherboard. So I had to take the motherboard out, disconnect the second player port and the power and reset switch, get everything lined back up, and then go ahead and put that back in. I didn't screw in the motherboard yet because you have to lift it up a little bit to get the cartridge tray in place. But once I got everything situated right, got the cartridge put in place, I was able to bolt down the bottom half. I did use the top RF shield to make sure I didn't put any screws in the wrong place, and just double check that I didn't have any extra screws. I've got the system assembled enough for testing, and I'm going to go ahead and put Mario back in here. Well, that was kind of weird. Turn it on. You can see first entry, and it went right on, but it's still really, really noisy. So I'm not sure what that's about. I really thought that was a capacitor issue. Let me go ahead and shut that off. We're going to do something different here. Let's try component real quick. Come on. Well, definitely much cleaner signal on component. But you can already see that everything is much cleaner. You can actually read the word Mario, the date and time. So part of that might be the scaling of the TV. But looks like component works, but the RF modulator does not. So perhaps the RF modulator itself is malfunctioning, or there's something wrong with this TV. I'd have to do some more testing to know for sure. But with that test in place, go ahead and shut it off. Testing started out great. You saw me shut off the console in the video just a second ago without any problems. Here I am playing Tetris and it's working fine, but when I shut off the console to take out Tetris, I had a really hard time to get the console to let go of the cartridge. It just wasn't working very well, and I know a lot of people say that these connectors, these replacements that are manufactured overseas, aren't the best, and this is the first time I've actually used one of them, and you could really see that it just would not let go of the cartridge. And the other thing I noticed when I put the games in, they kind of sink down just a little bit on their own, like it's not lined up exactly correct. So I'm going to try and see if I can finish remanufacturing mine and get it working. But I'm going to put Mario in here and turn on the console, and you can see, unfortunately, I've gone back to having the gray screen problem, the distorted images, and clearly that means something's still wrong with the console. My initial rounds of testing didn't go so good. Everything looked good, and then suddenly I started having problems again. And I was really disheartened by that. So I started playing around with the Nintendo, experimenting with it, and there's a couple things that have happened off camera that I want to tell you about, because the Nintendo is now working 100% properly. So here I have this new connector. I'm assuming it's made somewhere in China, somewhere overseas, and I definitely experienced the death grip with this connector. For some reason, this particular one wouldn't let go of my cartridges very well, and I'm not sure that it's broken, other than that it hangs on really tight, but I ended up refurbishing my connector, and I have the original connector in this Nintendo now. I used a little bit of sandpaper, 300 or 400 grit, sanded a little bit on the connectors just to make sure that there wasn't anything in there. It was really hard to get in there with anything, so that piece of sandpaper folded in half fit in there like a piece of paper. I had tried washing it with isopropyl alcohol and a toothbrush. I just don't know if I was getting in deep enough or was doing a good job. But then each little pin, hopefully this will focus, but you can see each little pin is lifted up in there just a little bit above the plastic. The connector that I have was really loose, and all of those pins over time had worn down. I think it's just the mechanical motion when you put the game in here and then lock it down in place. It just puts a little bit of pressure on there, and over time they bent down. But lifted each one of those pins up like I've seen on other YouTube channels when they've restored a Nintendo. The first time I've ever refurbished this connector by myself. Also the first time I've ever had a death grip connector. But that seems to have helped with the Nintendo cartridge read problem. But the other thing that I did, I found out that the security chip in the Nintendo can cause the gray screen, or the power light of death, or red light of death. I forget what they called it. I didn't know that was a thing on this Nintendo until I was doing some research, but the security chip apparently will go bad and cause the gray screen and the problems that I was experiencing. So I went ahead and disconnected pin 4 on the security chip. I'll go ahead and show a picture of that motherboard so you can see where the chip is on the motherboard, and then I'll zoom in on the chip and show you right here where pin 4 is. That way you absolutely can see what I changed. And with that, the security chip is disabled, and it seems to be loading my games. Now, I don't have any import games. I don't care about playing PAL games. Other than the cartridge is loading correctly every time the first time. That's the benefit that disabling that chip does for me. But if you have a PAL TV, because of the different frequencies instead of an NTSC TV, your console that is originally America NTSC can play both types of games. I don't think the mod works on a PAL, but I really would rather have not made that change, but it seems to be the only way I could get this Nintendo working, and you can't buy those chips because they're proprietary. So with those two changes, let me go ahead and show you. I can take a cartridge, slip it in, turn it on, and it works reliably the first time, every time. I haven't had a single problem loading any game, and if I start Super Mario Brothers, we'll actually get sounds. So there you go. The sound is crisp and clean. There's no issues with the sound. And again, over the AB, the composite video, not component. I know I said component earlier, but it seems to be working just fine. There's really no issues playing the game. And up in the O that I had pointed out earlier, where it was really super jagged, where the lines seem to be offset, you can see that they're really straight, and you can actually read it here in the blue screen. When I was underground and the background was black, it was actually pretty easy to read before. But let me go ahead and shut that off, and you can see I can remove the cartridge with one hand the way it was designed by Nintendo. Put in Tetris, turn that on, and it'll also load on the first try. So this console is fixed. And I would recommend anybody who has a Nintendo go ahead and give this a try, because it seemed pretty straightforward and pretty easy to do the recap. I know that won't be necessary on everybody's, but refurbishing your own connector is definitely something I would recommend. And here you can see Tetris loads up, and if I stop talking, you can hear that the music is working perfectly. So I want to say thank you for watching this video. Give me the thumbs up if you liked this video. Tell me what you liked. Give me the thumbs down if you didn't like the video, and tell me what I can improve on in future videos. If you like my content, please subscribe to my channel. That'll help me out a lot, and I will see you in a future video. Thank you so much.